All right, greetings, folks. It's Jay again, and I'm going to continue with the with controversialness and controversy, and I'm going to bring up a topic that's quite fascinating and it's been brought to my attention, and I wanted to discuss it. And it is conservative Goths. Dun dun dun. And I remember way back in the day, somebody had asked me, "Oh, it's impossible. You can't be a conservative and be a Goth." But let's establish this first and foremost. The Gothic subculture does not confine itself to an ideology, whether it be political, religious, etc. Despite the stereotypes. Going along with that, what are some of the stereotypes? Well, if you take a look at Goths, the Goth subculture as far as, late 1970s into the 80s, etc., it has its punk roots. And interestingly enough, punk rock kind of has a couple of different ways to look at it. You have it where there's the shock and controversy, but there's also kind of the, it all depends on the band. Some bands were like, yeah, the working class, and then others were, anarchy. So, and once again, it has me thinking about, maybe it's because of the coronavirus, but I keep thinking about Mad Max and when I'm going to, build a monster truck with fire that shoots out of it, and maybe I'll have somebody playing guitar like in Fury Road. But anyway, getting off topic, let's get back. Anyway, you have those origins with that, where it was kind of like, oh, we're the outcast, we're the downtrodden, so to speak. So this culture, it came from punk, but it was the more, romanticized. Now, punk rock, a little bit more has kind of, stronger leanings towards certain ideologies, etc. But goth was kind of more open, so to speak. Like I said, it has its punk rock roots. But it's a little bit more than that. It focused not only on the music, but there was also the fashion, etc., and that kind of transcended all that. And anywho, so that goes all throughout the into the 80s. Now, if you take a look at the 80s, a few of the bands, look at Christian Death and a few of the others, you can see how they grew up in these kind of strict Christian homes, and they're like, oh, I oppose Christianity. And it's fascinating because the 80s were that era of what's it called? Those mega churches. And it's funny, me growing up in the 90s, I had no idea about these crazy mega churches, but where they're da-da, and people are flying everywhere. I shouldn't laugh, but it cracks me up. I get it. I get why there was such this, anti-religious sentiments. But anyway, I get where that comes from. And me growing up in the 90s, you had it where in Christianity and in growing up as a Christian, you had this underground music with Christian artists that were of all kinds of genres. You had Christian heavy metal, you had Christian punk rock, you had even in the goth scene, you had bands like Savior Machine or The Awakening. And a band like Savior Machine, they got a ton of flack early on for their appearance, how they were in the Gothic subculture. And, the Christians are like, oh, you don't look like a Christian. Whoa. And they completely forget about the Bible verse that says, judge not, the outward appearance, but within. I'm definitely paraphrasing that, so shame on me, but I'm just saying, it goes into how, we're to be judged for what's inside. So, going along with that, obviously I've already established that in my personal views, I'm a Christian of faith, and so that reflects in my political views. I personally tend to lean a little bit more towards the conservative side. There are some things that I disagree with and agree with when it comes to political parties, etc. But generally, I lean a little bit more towards the conservative side. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So, but anywho, going into a little bit of the history, you have the 90s, you have the Gothic subculture, but it kind of expands. You have bands that they're not exactly goth rock, so they're not like traditional goth, but you have these bigger names like Marilyn Manson and, you know, whatever, Nine Inch Nails, and they're all controversial in their lyrics and everything. And so you have that era of censorship. And that's where I want to go into censorship. Now, funny, yesterday, now this is on topic, I was watching an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and one of the fascinating things, it was like one of the episodes about like Thunder Gun or whatever, the fictional movie they have in the show. But anyway, one of the things one of the characters says is that back in the day, it was the like right-wing conservatives that were, you know, all about censorship and like, don't say that, don't say this, blah, blah, blah. And that's where you have, you know, Marilyn Manson and like Kid Rock and like, what else? Eminem and all those artists, those controversial artists of the 90s opposing censorship, Korn and all those other big name bands that were like against censorship and all that stuff. It's fascinating. But Marilyn Manson today, if he goes onto the Grammys and starts ripping up a Bible, although everybody in the audience now is going to be like, that's so brave, that's so stunning, I can't believe it, it's beautiful. But you know what would be controversial? If Marilyn Manson or somebody like that went up on stage and actually started reading from the Bible. Like, it's not funny, it's terrible, but that would be controversial. So it's shifted. That's what's going on in the past, you know, however long it's been, decade plus. It's no longer the right that is the censorship, etc. It's actually the left. And as you have these younger generations, you know, you have it where they're like, whoa, 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 you know, what's up with this censorship? And, oh, this isn't, you know, what's going on with this? And blah, blah, blah. And that's where you have a lot of those problems. And so it's interesting, you have nowadays, politically speaking, especially in the Gothic subculture, etc., it's all over the place. I would still say stereotypically most in the Gothic subculture tend to lean towards the left, especially socially. I think most Goths, quote unquote, tend to be open-minded, but then again, you know, there's a lot of hypocrisy with that, because you could walk up to, you know, folks in the Gothic subculture and they'd be like, oh yeah, we have like our occult weekend, or we do our Wicca weekend, and then the moment I say, oh, I go to church on Sunday, they'll be like, ugh, you go to church? Ugh. Like there's hypocrisy there. You know, I'd love to see it where everybody tolerated everybody's views, but that's, you know, perfect world. But anyway, the point is that I would say there is, you know, are folks that have those viewpoints, etc. And, you know, the goth scene, especially the goth scene, has always been about individuality. And you see a lot of folks that lean more towards like, you know, I don't want big government, I don't want this, I don't want the censorship, just let us be, let us do our own thing. So you see a lot of libertarians, you see a lot of folks that lean more towards the right, because you have it where these folks, you know, they recognize the fact that there's a lot of this censorship and like, oh, well, that's not politically correct, you can't say that, and there's these controversies that are blowing up, and so, you know, you have it where one, you know, industrial musician says something crazy 20 years ago, like they make a joke about something, and then they're lit on fire, their tour's canceled. It's like, what? It's like, well, wait a second, what did this guy say that was so controversial that Eminem or, you know what I mean, or Marilyn Manson or one of these bigger names, what did they said all these things. Like, you got what you wanted in a way. Like, the conservatives are no longer getting on the backs of folks for censorship, and it's now the intolerant left that kind of leans more towards the censorship, so to speak. It's a fascinating thing how this is coming up, but then you have the current era, and so love them or hate them, you know, you have it where, you know, there's President Trump, and so the thing that's interesting about it is this guy is not exactly part of that clique, that like DC clique. This is a guy that's just a random business guy that was in Home Alone 2. But anyway, he's elected president, and folks are freaking out and all this other stuff. And so, yeah, there's bad, and then there's good. But you can see that divide. People are freaking out, and I think you see a lot of, the intolerance there just for that. And it's like people aren't talking to each other. I think that's probably the most damaging thing, not just in the Gothic scene, but probably in America right now, is the fact that people aren't having civilized discussions. Like, oh, why do you feel this way? Why do you view this way? Why do you have this viewpoint? Me, as a Christian, it should come as no surprise that there's certain social matters like whatever, pro-life, etc. And then when it comes to, I'm a military guy, so, the Second Amendment, of course, like, I believe you should be responsible with firearms, but, and I'm all for background checks, but it's a constitutional right. Nobody should be like, oh, well, you have this type of gun. Well, I'm not saying, like, if I have a, 40 millimeter Bofors cannon, obviously, if I'm not supposed to have it, I'm not supposed to have it. But I'm saying generically, like, who are you to constitute, what's this and what's that? And so I believe strongly in that Second Amendment right, because I enjoy shooting. I like going out to the range and shooting some rounds. So I should be able to enjoy that. So anyway, there are certain viewpoints that I have personally, and like I said, as a Christian, I believe, and then there's some I don't, like, it doesn't all fit into one category. What was that? Category. So, but that's one of the things that makes the Gothic subculture so unique, is that there are folks from all across the globe. They all have their different viewpoints, and I'd say we're generally pretty open-minded. And so that open-mindedness should go across various, whether you lean towards the conservative side or the liberal side, there should be, civilized discussion. There should be civilized debates, etc. Just because, if somebody says, oh, I'm voting for blah, 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 you should probably ask, if you're friends with them, why not ask why? Why do they have that viewpoint? And then have a civilized, you don't have to debate it all out, like sit there and weigh your pros and cons, but you can just have the discussion. You'll probably learn a lot more of why people view certain things. So, anyway, absolutely, there are conservative Goths out there, and there are folks that they have those viewpoints, and including myself, where I have my viewpoints that lean towards the more conservative side. So it should have it where folks should be able to have their discussions politically, I'm getting tongue-tied. But anyway, they should be able to discuss their viewpoints and their ideologies, whether whatever side of the fence they lean on, politically speaking. There should be that friendly discussion, because that's what keeps the scene unique, and it keeps folks a greater understanding of people. So with that, I shall conclude. Take care, and till next time, stay safe in the era of the coronavirus, my friends. And make sure to rock out to some good music, and once again, stay safe. Okay? Till next time.